A roll-by-roll agenda for decisions that can't wait until summer. There is a particular kind of organizational risk that does not show up on any single department's radar. It does not belong cleanly to operations or finance or sustainability or technology. It lives in the space between those functions, quietly compounding while each team manages its own piece of a larger picture nobody is looking at whole. That is the risk most organizations are carrying into Q2 right now. Q1 surfaced real signals across energy, infrastructure, compliance, and capital markets. What follows is a straightforward account of what those signals mean for each function and the decisions that are genuinely harder to make in August than they are today. For the C-suite, the gaps between functions are where the real risk lives. Executive teams have spent most of Q1 managing individual issues in relative isolation. Compliance teams worked through the implications of federal regulatory changes. Energy teams tracked grid reliability updates. Finance teams watched refinancing conditions. Each function did its job. The problem is that none of those issues is actually separate. Energy exposure intersects with capital planning. Compliance fragmentation intersects with legal liability. Infrastructure constraints intersect with operational execution timelines. When those intersections are not visible to the people making resource and budget decisions, the cost of that blind spot surfaces later and in ways that are much harder to address. Capital is available for companies that have done the cross-functional work to identify what is actually deployable. Those that have not are watching investment cycle past them to organizations that were ready. Each function did its job. The problem is that none of these issues is actually separate from the others. Before Q2 budgets lock, executive teams should be stress testing capital plans against three converging realities: tightening energy availability, selective financing conditions for emissions-intensive assets, and infrastructure constraints that are structural rather than temporary. These are not separate line items. They are the same problem viewed from different angles. For facilities and energy, grid risk has moved into the capital plan. Treat it that way. For a long time, grid constraints were understood as an operational headache: interconnection delays, reliability concerns, the ongoing challenge of managing peak demand. That framing is no longer adequate. In 2026, grid constraints are a financial risk, and they belong in capital planning conversations, not just operations reports. The Wimbledon Dickinson Energy Outlook 2026 draws on research from more than 650 senior energy leaders globally and found that more than 70% of U.S. companies across major energy sectors now identify grid and infrastructure limitations as their most significant barrier to growth. Nearly a quarter of new global capacity is being held back, not by financing gaps or lack of projects, but by bottlenecks in grid connection and permitting. That is a structural condition, not a temporary one. S&P Global projects data center power demand alone growing 17% through 2026, and that load growth is entering an interconnection queue that is already at historic lengths. For facilities teams with energy procurement responsibilities or capital projects that depend on grid access, the interconnection timeline is a variable that belongs in the project pro forma from day one, not as a footnote discovered at execution. Worth reading: Brazilian grid equipment maker picks North Carolina for U.S. debut, a signal of where domestic infrastructure investment is heading and why supply chains for grid components are tightening closer to home. For sustainability and EHS, build your compliance map from where the business actually operates. If your team spent part of Q1 recalibrating compliance posture around federal regulatory changes, it is worth pausing to ask whether that recalibration was built on the right map. What shifted at the federal level is real. The SEC pulled back from climate disclosure rulemaking. Several ESG-related rules at the Department of Labor were paused or withdrawn. But those changes describe what the federal government is doing. They do not describe what California, New York, the European Union, and the United Kingdom are doing, and for most large organizations, those jurisdictions matter as much or more. State attorneys general in California, New York, and Washington, D.C. are actively pursuing greenwashing enforcement under consumer protection statutes, and legal analysts at Linklaters expect that activity to intensify through the rest of the year. The EU's Environmental Crime Directive must be transposed into national law by member states in May 2026, adding criminal enforcement exposure to environmental violations in ways that go meaningfully beyond civil regulatory frameworks. The Q2 task for EHS and sustainability teams is straightforward. Make sure the compliance map reflects the real jurisdictional footprint of the business. The federal picture is one part of that map, not the whole thing. For procurement and supply chain, two pressures are converging. Neither one is moving slowly. Procurement teams are navigating two distinct but reinforcing forces heading into Q2, and together they make a passive monitoring posture genuinely difficult to defend. The U.S. Trade Representative has initiated Section 301 investigations into 60 economies, covering 99% of U.S. import volume, for failing to prohibit goods produced with forced labor. For any procurement function that has not yet mapped its supply base against that list, the exposure question is not theoretical. It is a matter of finding where it exists and determining what the response plan looks like. Running alongside that, supply chain due diligence under the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is entering what legal analysts at Hogan Lovells call its operationalization year. The omnibus simplification narrowed the directive's scope, but it did not change its fundamental requirement. Companies must demonstrate actual documented due diligence across their supply chains, not policy statements of intent. The shift from framework to functional process is the work of 2026, and procurement teams that have been engaging at a policy level need to be moving into implementation. For technology and digital operations, AI's energy footprint is already in the conversation. Map it before it maps you. The energy implications of AI infrastructure have been discussed at an industry level for long enough that they can start to feel like background noise. For technology and digital operations teams, they are not background. They are a direct operational and financial exposure that is already showing up in sustainability reports, investor conversations, and energy procurement discussions. S&P Global's 2026 energy research describes global data center power demand exceeding 2,200 terawatt-hours by the end of the decade. That is approximately equal to India's current total electricity consumption. The figure is large enough to seem like an industry-level abstraction, but the load growth driving it is happening now, and it shows up in corporate energy budgets and grid interconnection queues in ways that are not abstract at all. Technology teams that have not mapped the energy footprint of their AI and digital infrastructure against their organization's climate commitments are holding a gap that will surface in one of three places: in reporting, in procurement discussions with energy-conscious customers or investors, or in capital conversations where the cost of that load growth becomes visible for the first time. None of those is a comfortable moment to discover the number. Transmission infrastructure to deliver new power capacity can take a decade or more of planning, permitting, and construction. Digital operations teams are working inside that constraint, whether they have mapped it or not. Q2 is the time to plan with it, not around it. One question worth asking across every function. There is a straightforward way to prioritize what deserves attention before summer arrives. For each of the issues above, ask, what is the cost of making this decision in August versus making it now? In some cases, the answer is modest. In others, the cost is a narrowed set of options: a compliance window that has already closed, a capital plan that no longer reflects the infrastructure conditions the business is actually operating in, or a supplier relationship that was not examined until it became an enforcement question. The organizations that will be best positioned in the second half are the ones acting on what they already know, not the ones waiting for conditions to become more clear. The signals are not new. Grid constraints are documented. Compliance fragmentation is mapped. Supply chain pressure is quantified. Capital is moving toward organizations with project-ready infrastructure. The differentiation in Q3 and Q4 will come from what each function did with that information before summer. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.